Part 3 Hatha Yoga Renaissance. Both in India and in Europe, two similar processes started simultaneously. In Europe, the interest turned back to physical body. At that very period, Per Genrich Link created what we know now as classical or Swedish massage. Of course, at that time he was largely criticized and was considered to be pretty unscientific, but now it's considered to be classical. And Müller had created so-called Müller system, and later there emerged many healing bodily practices in Europe. Well, it's a great topic for discussion, and now we will just mention that it appeared. And at that time in India there started the Indian Liberation Movement. One of its leaders and ideologists, the Balgandhar Tilak, is known for his concept of Arctic home in Vedas. He had been proving that Aryans had come not from some Black or Caspian seas, but they came from the northern motherland, the Arctide, which had to be some specific mainland. He was proving this based on in-depth analysis of Rig Veda and have taken into account some astronomical and mythological data. Well, now this book is not considered to be scientifical, though it's still very interesting and shows in-depth knowledge of Rig Veda text. But I'm talking about Tilak not because of his home and Arctic Vedas, but because he was one of the first to understand that the true liberation movement must start not in the military circles, but in the mentality and mind. It has to be the change of one's self-identity, the change from something secondary by turning to one's spiritual roots, which in fact had happened in India. In 1825 there was formed the Brahma Samaj Society, which aim was to recreate the Vedic spirituality. And about 50 years later there was created the Arya Samaj Society, which had made some further steps. In fact, there started the recreation of India's interest to its own roots, and particularly to yoga. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there had lived four men who had created the yoga as we know it today. In fact, these men had reformed, transformed and created some new yoga. And this had happened on the wave of India's own interest to its roots. These are Swami Shivananda, Sri Krishnamacharya, Sri Yogendra and Dhirendra Brahmachari. We will start with Sri Krishnamacharya, who had the greatest influence on modern European yoga. Following traditions belong to Sri Krishnamacharya's lineage. These are the tradition of Sri Pataphi Jois and his Ashtanga Yoga, and the tradition of BKS Iyengar, and the Deshikachar tradition, and Indra Devi, the founder of American and Mexican yogas, and several more personalities, which I will mention later. The well-known Russian yoga scientist Marina Nikolaeva had reason to call Sri Krishnamacharya to be the whirlpool in the stream of yoga. In fact, this was the man who was not just studying and practicing yoga, but he was the one who had created yoga. Suffice it to say that Sri Pataphi Jois, Iyengar and Deshikachar, three of his greatest students, had learned yoga from him. And these are three most powerful yoga schools in the world. And these three schools practice an absolutely different yoga, and even not nearly similar if we will take a closer look. So how could this happen if each of them had received yoga from Krishnamacharya? Because Krishnamacharya was a truly great teacher, and he gave to each of them the yoga which each of them needed most. And he might have given some other yogas to B.N.S. Iyengar or some Mahan or somebody else. So Krishnamacharya had been creating an absolutely new yoga, and his reformatory spirit was amazing. To start with, he had synthesized southern and northern branches of yoga. Krishnamacharya himself had descended from the ancient clan of the Alvars. Some great Tamil mystic had been his ancestor, the one who was considered to be the author of the legendary Yoga Rahasya. So Krishnamacharya had started practicing yoga in his family tradition. But then, to understand this tradition, he started learning Ayurveda, university philosophy, and then he went to North India and Nepal to study the tradition of Northern Yoga and Yoga Sutras. And merging these two traditions, he had created his own unique style of yoga. And within that style, he had made lots of unusual transformations. In fact, he had created an idea of dynamic yoga. And not only he had synthesized North and South Indian styles, but also he had added the Western tendencies of his time and brought dynamics to yoga. And if you would take a look at video files of Krishnamacharya's yoga practice, he practices very complex exercises, but still this is obviously yoga. The exercises which he performs could be done by any gymnast, but the smoothness of how he does it could be obtained only with the very deep control of one's psyche. So this is how Krishnamacharya's yoga had looked like. However, we may be cautious saying about this because during his lifetime, his style of yoga practice constantly changed. So what else had Krishnamacharya done apart from he had raised 3 great descendants? As I said, he had synthesized different yoga styles and different healing procedures and techniques, and in general he made yoga popular in India. Being the head of Mysore Palace Yoga Shala, he had popularized yoga and created the demand for yoga. He introduced the idea of dynamic yoga. He suggested the idea of personalized yoga practice, which is still practiced in Chennai in his Krishnamacharya Yoga Institute. He had revived the idea that yoga could be therapy, which was firstly introduced in Hatha Yoga Pradipika. The Yoga Rahasya treatise he actually wrote himself. Of course, as said, he had seen its text in some state of mystical enlightenment. So in Yoga Rahasya, yoga is not only a mystical teaching, but also a therapeutic teaching. He significantly contributed to new yoga exercises. And last but not least, he had adapted many yoga tests for the European mentality. There exists a Yoga Sutra translation by Krishnamacharya. Well, in fact, it has very little to do with the original text of Yoga Sutra, but nevertheless, his text itself is ingenious. It's a truly deep text, and it's understandable for the European, and thus it is incredibly useful, although being very far from original text. But in fact, as I understand, Krishnamacharya was a truly great teacher, and he was not afraid to create something new. For instance, take into account that Yoga Rahasya, which he wrote himself, and then he had enough courage to say that it is that very same Yoga Rahasya, as well as implementing dynamic exercises to yoga, referring to some Mysore Palace text which has nobody seen so far. And he said that there actually was this text, and now it's a commonplace to see the vinyasas, the dynamic exercises in yoga, as well as implementing power exercises to yoga. Actually, Mark Singleton, the famous yoga researcher, writes the following. Near Krishnamacharya's Yoga Shala, there was some kind of British gym. Krishnamacharya looked at that exercises and added some of them to the yoga exercises. So he was creating yoga. That's why he was called the Whirlpool in the stream of yoga. So he gathered everything possible, mixed it within himself, and created many new yoga approaches. He lived 101 years, and he practiced till the very last year of his life. He was still alive in 1980, and he was an incredibly strict and hard man. To better understand him as a person, we might refer to his biography. For example, while there was some shift in Indian government and Krishnamacharya's Yoga Shala was sponsored by the government, and then the government shifted and it was suggested that Yoga Shala should be closed, and state governor had wrote him a letter saying to come and receive the proper instructions, and Krishnamacharya replied that if the governor needs to see him, then he may come to his Yoga Shala on his own and they may have a talk. Surely the governor became angry and tried to close this Yoga Shala. Yoga Shala student had organized strike near the governor's residency. The governor was going to calm students down, but while he was on his way, he had broke some part of his body. And as every reasonable Hindu, he understood that he was not right. So he had apologized and asked Krishnamacharya for healing, and Krishnamacharya had healed him. And it may be interesting that first money Krishnamacharya had received from Mysore Maharaja, healing him from some uncured disease, and only then he had received his first privilege to go to the north. There he had cured the Shimla governor and received an ability to go to Nepal. So this was an incredible man, and concerning his contribution to 20th century yoga, it's so huge that it even cannot be observed. Without him, we would have known very little of yoga.